All right, get ready to dive deep because today we're tackling pre-reflective consciousness.
Sounds a little intimidating, right?
Well, you sent us these excerpts from, get this, pre-reflective consciousness, Sartre and contemporary. Just the title alone, and I'm already feeling like I need a stronger prescription for my glasses.
Yeah, it's definitely some dense philosophical material.
That's why you've got us, though, right? We'll
Yeah,
break it down, hopefully make it a little more, approachable.
absolutely. Happy to help with that.
So, pre-reflective consciousness. In a nutshell, what are we even talking about here?
Okay, so imagine the kind of awareness you have before you even start thinking about it. That immediate experience, that's basically what we're talking about, like the most fundamental layer of our consciousness?
So, like, I'm aware of the world, I'm aware that I exist, even if I'm not actively thinking, hey, I'm me experiencing this.
You got it. And for philosophers, this isn't just some random idea. They think this pre-reflective consciousness might hold the key to understanding some of the biggest questions about what it means to be human, to be conscious.
I could see why they'd be hooked on that. But in the preface you sent, there's this whole thing about pushing back against naturalized epistemology. I'm guessing it's about looking beyond just the brain to understand consciousness fully.
You're picking up what they're putting down, for sure. A lot of these excerpts are arguing that if we only focus on the physical mechanics of the brain, the hardware, so to speak, we might be missing something crucial about the actual feeling, the subjective experience of consciousness.
So instead of just the hardware, we need to understand the software, the subjective experience itself.
Right. Imagine trying to understand what it's like to listen to music, but all you do is analyze sound waves and how the ear works. You'd completely miss the emotional impact the way music makes you feel.
Makes sense.
And that's kind of the challenge these excerpts are wrestling with. How do you capture that essence of this inner pre-reflective awareness?
Which leads us to Brentano and Husserl, who are all over these excerpts. Seems they had some thoughts on this
Oh,
one.
absolutely. They're like giants in this field, but they definitely had different things they were really into. Like Brentano, he was obsessed with this thing called intentionality. Basically, the idea that consciousness is always pointing towards something. Even pre-reflective awareness, he thought, was directed outwards in some way.
So even when we're not actively thinking about anything specific, our awareness is still always about something, according to Brentano.
Exactly. Now, Husserl, on the other hand, he was way more interested in the structure of experience itself. Like, what's the underlying framework of consciousness, regardless of what it's focused on at any given moment?
So Brentano, he's all about what consciousness is pointing at, while Husserl is more into what consciousness is made of. Did they end up with similar conclusions given their different focuses?
It's interesting, right? Because even though they were both looking at pre-reflective consciousness, those different focuses led to some pretty unique interpretations. Just goes to show, even within a specific school of thought, a big complex idea like this, it can have multiple interpretations.
It's amazing how even brilliant minds can look at the same thing in such different ways. And speaking of different ways of looking at things, there's this excerpt that talks about the explanatory gap
Mhm.
and compares pre-reflective consciousness to an inner framework. It almost makes it sound like there's more to consciousness than just the physical stuff of the brain. Am I reading too much into that?
That's a big question, right at the heart of one of the biggest debates in philosophy, the whole mind-body problem thing.
Hmm.
And you're right, some philosophers, they look at pre-reflective consciousness and see it as a real problem for purely physical explanations of consciousness. Like maybe there's something special about subjective experience, something that can't just be reduced to neurons firing.
So like there's something more to it, something science can't fully explain yet.
Yeah, exactly. Think about it, like for centuries, people looked at lightning and were just baffled by it. We could describe it, but we didn't really get what was going on. And now we know it's an electrical discharge. Some philosophers think consciousness might have a similar aha moment coming.
Makes you wonder what other mysteries we're going to figure out in the future. But okay, this whole inner framework idea, I feel like that's a metaphor people could interpret in a lot of different ways.
Oh, for sure. It really shows how one concept can land so differently depending on what you already believe. Like some people might hear inner framework and think, oh, sounds like something beyond the physical. While others, they might hear it and think about the structure of experience, even if it's still ultimately happening in the brain.
Which reminds me, we haven't even gotten to the different levels or layers of consciousness. One of these excerpts mentions this positional and non-positional consciousness. Sounds pretty complicated. Is that really important for Understanding this pre-reflective stuff?
Oh, it's totally key. Okay, so imagine positional consciousness is like, shining a spotlight on something specific, like that delicious cup of coffee you're about to have, or maybe the sound of birds outside your window. Very focused, very directed.
Okay, so it's like whatever we're directly paying attention to in our experience, that makes sense. What about this non-positional kind then?
So think of non-positional consciousness as that general awareness that's always running in the background. It's that subtler awareness that you're alive, you're experiencing the world, even if you're not like zeroed in on anything particular.
So sticking with that spotlight idea, if positional consciousness is the spotlight, non-positional consciousness is like the ambient light. It's the bigger context where all those focused experiences happen.
Exactly. You got it. That's a great way to put it. It's really like the foundation of all our experience. And to connect this back to our whole pre-reflective thing, a lot of philosophers, they think pre-reflective consciousness is probably closest to this non-positional awareness. It's like that fundamental presence underlying all our experiences.
It's like pre-reflective consciousness is the stage, and then all our thoughts, our feelings, sensations, they're like the actors playing out their roles. And speaking of actors, this excerpt also mentions the ego. How does that fit into all of this?
Oh, the ego. This is where it gets really interesting, especially when we bring in someone like Sartre. He argued that our everyday sense of self that we all feel so strongly, it's actually a kind of construction, a projection that comes out of our pre-reflective awareness.
So it's not that our sense of self is like fake, but it's more that we create it, that it emerges from something more fundamental.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. Sartre thought that at the level of pre-reflective awareness, we're actually way more free and open than we realize. We're not solidified into that fixed me we usually experience ourselves as. It's only later, through thinking about ourselves, through our interactions with other people, through all those experiences, that the ego starts to solidify, that sense of a separate self.
So it's like the ego is this character we make up and play in the story of our lives. And over time, that character becomes so convincing, we forget we're the ones playing the role.
That is such a great analogy. It really gets at the heart of what Sartre was getting at. He really thought this realization that the ego is a construction is actually incredibly liberating.
Liberating how?
Well, because if our sense of self is something we construct, that means we can reconstruct it, right? We're not bound by this fixed, unchanging identity. We have the freedom to change, to grow, to decide who we want to be.
Okay, that is kind of a mind-blowing idea,
Yeah.
but also a little bit terrifying. Like, is who we are, is that fluid? How do we even function in the world? How do we have relationships? Make any sense of our lives?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And it's something these excerpts really wrestle with. They seem to be saying that, yeah, the ego, the constructed self, it can box us in sometimes. But it's also how we navigate the world. It gives us some sense of continuity, helps us make decisions, connect with others who are also operating from that same kind of framework.
So it's like finding that balance.
Yeah.
Recognizing that the ego is constructed, but not just throwing it out completely.
Exactly. It's about becoming aware of how our egos, our constructed selves, are shaping how we see things, how we relate to people, how we experience the world. And with that awareness, we can start making more conscious choices about who we want to be and how we want to live our lives.
It really makes you wonder how different things would be if we were more aware of those projections we're carrying around. All those stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what's possible.
Totally. It's a fascinating thing to think about. And honestly, it's something these excerpts are encouraging us to explore.
Now, if our sense of self is a projection, does that mean we're all just living in our own separate realities? How can we ever really connect with other people if our perceptions are so subjective?
That is a big one, isn't it? It gets right to the heart of relationships. And yeah, these excerpts, they acknowledge that our individual perspectives are always shaping, coloring our experiences. But they also suggest there are ways to move beyond those limited viewpoints.
Okay, so how do we do that? Bridge that gap? How do we connect with others if we're all trapped in our own heads?
Well, these excerpts point towards empathy, really emphasize empathy and compassion as those crucial first steps. It's like, instead of seeing other people through the lens of our own projections, what if we try to see the world through their eyes? Really try to understand their experiences, their values, their hopes, all of that.
So recognizing that their egos, their own constructed selves, are just as real to them as ours are to us, even if they're different.
Exactly. It's about that shared humanity that's underneath all our differences. And honestly, it's those differences, those unique perspectives that make life interesting, you know?
Yeah, for sure. So it's not about pretending everyone experiences the world the same way. It's more about expanding our own perspective to include the experiences of others.
You got it. That's exactly it. Cultivating curiosity, openness, willingness to see things in new ways.
Which makes me think about that part about how just paying attention to our experiences, it actually changes them. Like the very act of observing something changes it.
It's true. And it's not just about our inner world, our thoughts and feelings. Even in physics, they've found that observing a subatomic particle actually changes how it behaves. It's wild.
Mhm.
Like consciousness itself is playing a role in shaping reality.
Okay, that is mind-blowing. So we're not just watching the world go by, we're actually helping to create it.
That's the implication, and it's a big one. Our thoughts, our beliefs, our intentions, they all have a real impact.
So if our intentions shape reality, does that mean we can just manifest whatever we want by like wishing it into existence?
That's a popular idea these days, isn't it? The whole manifesting thing. And yeah, these excerpts, they do suggest that our intentions influence things, but they also say, don't oversimplify it.
So it's not as easy as just like making a wish and hoping for the best.
Not quite. These philosophers would say that our intentions are just one part of a much bigger picture. It's not just about our thoughts, it's about our actions, our choices, how we're actually engaging with the world, you know?
So not just thinking positive thoughts, but actually aligning our actions with what we want and, putting in the work.
Yes, exactly. It's about understanding that we're both creators of our reality and part of this huge web of interconnectedness. Our actions have consequences, and those consequences, they ripple out in ways we might not even
It's
realize.
like that whole karma thing. What we put out there comes back to us.
That's an interesting connection. These excerpts, they don't actually use the word karma, but they do talk about a kind of ethical feedback loop that's built into reality. Like, the more we act with compassion, with kindness, with understanding, the more we create a world that reflects those things back to us.
And the reverse is true too. If we're acting out of selfishness, greed, anger, that also shapes the world around us. Which brings us to the big question, right? What does all this mean for us in our own lives?
Hmm.
How do we take these big philosophical ideas and apply them to our everyday experiences? That's the million-dollar question, right? How do we actually take all this heady stuff about consciousness and make it relevant to our lives?
Yeah.
Easy to get lost in the philosophy, but I'm guessing there's some practical wisdom in here too.
Oh, absolutely. One of the biggest takeaways from these excerpts, I think, is this idea of recognizing our own agency. Like, if it's true that our thoughts, our intentions, they actually shape our reality, well, then understanding our own minds, that becomes super important.
So less about consciousness as this abstract thing and more about the power of our minds to actually influence our experience, influence the world.
Exactly. It's like we're not just along for the ride, we're active participants in how our lives unfold. And that's a powerful realization to have.
Makes you wonder how differently we'd all live if we really truly believed that, right?
It's a really interesting thought. And, to tie it back to pre-reflective consciousness, these excerpts seem to suggest that one of the ways we unlock that agency is by becoming more aware of how our minds work in the first place, developing what some folks call meta-awareness.
Okay, so by meta-awareness, we're talking about like a heightened self-awareness, being conscious of our thoughts, emotions, all of it as it's happening.
Exactly. It's that ability to kind of step back and observe your own mind in action without judgment. See how your thoughts, your beliefs, even stuff from your past, it's all shaping how you experience the world.
And how do we do that? Is this something you can like practice?
That's the question, right? And luckily, these excerpts, they offer some answers. They talk about things like meditation, mindfulness, even certain types of therapy as ways to develop this self-observation muscle.
So it's about quieting all that mental noise,
Yeah.
being more present, less caught up in the constant chatter of our mind.
That's at the heart of it. And they suggest that the more we can cultivate that meta-awareness, the more freedom we have to choose how we respond to the world around us.
Instead of just reacting automatically, we can actually choose how we show up.
Exactly. And that takes us to another key point: introspection. Now, introspection, looking inward, it's important. But these excerpts, they're also really honest about its limitations.
So it's not enough to just like sit around thinking about our feelings all day. There's more to it.
Right. Remember that whole thing about observing something, changing it? Well, that happens with introspection too. As soon as you turn your attention inward, you're already changing the very thing you're trying to observe. It's tricky.
Like when you try to remember a dream, the harder you try, the more it slips away.
Perfect analogy. That's exactly it. It's the paradox of introspection. You got to look inward to understand yourself, but the very act of looking can mess things up.
Okay, so how do we deal with that? If we can't trust our own introspection, then what are we supposed to do?
Well, here's where those excerpts give us some good advice. They're saying go into introspection with a bit of skepticism, a bit of humility. Don't be afraid to question your own assumptions. Be open to other perspectives. Remember, understanding yourself, it's a journey, not a destination.
So less judgment, more curiosity about our own minds.
Exactly. And also remembering that true self-knowledge, it doesn't just come from analyzing your thoughts. It comes from action, from trying things out, from actually living your life and seeing what happens.
Like that saying, the best way to predict the future is to create it. We can sit around thinking all day long, but at the end of the day, how we live our lives, that's what really matters.
That's so true. And it points to this interconnectedness between our thoughts, our actions, our experiences. It's all one big web. And speaking of interconnectedness, these excerpts touch on another fascinating idea, that pre-reflective consciousness, it might actually be a source of creativity, of real insight.
Oh, okay, now that's interesting. How so? What does pre-reflective consciousness have to do with creativity?
Well, think about those moments when you have a big aha, that flash of insight that comes out of nowhere, when a solution to a problem just pops into your head as if it was always there, just beneath the surface.
Like when you've been stuck on a creative project and then suddenly, boom, the words come to you, the melody, the idea, whatever it is.
Exactly. And some philosophers think those moments, those are actually glimpses into pre-reflective consciousness, like a realm of awareness that's beyond our normal linear thinking.
So it's like our conscious mind, with all its thoughts and worries, it's just the tip of the iceberg. And underneath, there's this whole other level of creativity, of potential that we can access if we know how.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And these excerpts, they suggest that practices like meditation, being mindful, even certain forms of art, they can help us quiet the conscious mind and tap into that deeper level of awareness.
It makes you wonder what we're capable of if we could just learn to access that part of ourselves more consistently.
Right. It's exciting and a little bit mysterious. And ultimately, I think that's what these excerpts are pointing us towards. The incredible mystery, the amazing potential of human consciousness. They don't have all the answers, but they're an invitation to explore, to question our assumptions, to see the transformative power that comes with awareness.
It's been quite the journey, diving into these ideas, from pre-reflective consciousness and the ego, to intention, introspection, the interconnectedness of it all. Any final thoughts as we wrap up this deep dive?
Just this whole exploring consciousness thing, it's not about reaching some final destination, it's a journey. There's always more to discover, more to understand. So stay curious, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.
Couldn't have said it better myself. A huge thank you to our expert for walking us through all of this. And to everyone listening, we hope this deep dive has sparked something in you. Keep your minds open, keep those questions coming, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.